I think the first time I ever really got the sense that maybe there's something very deeply wrong with how people are feeling as a whole right now. It's actually when I was watching a movie. When I say deeply wrong, I don't mean morally wrong. I'm not saying that these people, the way that they're feeling is bad. I'm saying that I think there's been this deep shift on like an almost primal level in people's brains in how they see the world and how they interact with it. And the reason I say this, I was watching Don't Look Up. To be clear, it's not a good movie. It's very obviously a parallel between the way that people were behaving and the way that media interacted with that in the US election cycles in the last couple years. You look at it, and I think you can take that with a grain of salt, but what I was more interested in is the way that it ends. So the plot of the movie is that an asteroid is going to hit Earth in a couple days, and the scientists find out about this. So they, of course, are very concerned because it is a planet-wiping event. So they go to the US president, and they say, hey, this is a very serious problem. We need to let everybody know so that scientists can start working on a solution because we don't have a lot of time. We only have a couple months. The US president goes, well, I have an election coming up. So the election happens to be around basically the same time the asteroid is going to hit. And the president goes, I don't really want to let people know publicly because it'll affect my numbers and it'll just be bad for the country. At first, they try to work on it quietly, independently, but it's just too big. The scope is just too large of a problem for them to do on their own. So they go rogue, and the scientists begin telling people hey, this is a thing that is going to happen. We will not have a planet. And obviously they're not PR people. So they get absolutely eviscerated from every angle because you've got the media that has no interest in these things because they're not entertaining or they're too polarizing. Or the ones that are interested in polarization are more interested in firing people up instead of addressing the problem. Then you have the way that people on the internet react to information, which is generally a lot of disbelief, a lot of conspiracy. And it's very interesting because it creates a sort of schism. Again, the parallels are very obvious, where some of the people believe that the asteroid is a real threat and they're trying to unify to get the problem addressed, where a much larger group of people is very convinced that it's a hoax or a conspiracy because the government has been putting out basically a misinformation campaign to keep everyone complacent and to keep them arguing with each other, to prevent people from doing anything so that this president can be elected. But at the end of the movie, everyone dies. There are movies where it ends very negatively, and obviously speculative sci-fi, they deal with a lot of dystopian elements. But I found this one so interesting because it was an absolutely hopeless ending. They try really, really hard. They do everything they possibly can, and there's a moment where you believe that maybe they'll turn the tide. But by the time the asteroid's already in the sky and the people that were pro the president start seeing it and doubting themselves, it's already too late. There's also a bit of commentary on elitism in there, where the president and a variety of very wealthy people that they know believe that they'll get away by going on a spaceship. But the problem is their tech billionaire that they're friends with, no obvious parallels here, is not great at the R&D part of research and development, which is all of it. So at the very last minute, they get together this shitty plan that they're going to use robots to go onto the asteroid and explode it. And then if that doesn't work, they're going to escape in a spaceship. The problem is that the tech billionaire has very fanciful ideas, very similar to a specific tech billionaire who thought it was a great idea to use a submarine to rescue children. And then when that didn't work out, tried to accuse the person that was in charge of the rescue mission of being a criminal. Anyways, tech billionaire puts this together, but of course he skimped on a bunch of things. He didn't actually properly test these things before it was supposed to happen and just sort of threw it together. So it doesn't work. It fails. And then when they go to escape on the spaceship, that also doesn't really work either. So the movie ends with the asteroid hitting Earth and everyone dies. I've never seen that before until recently. More media exploring the idea, what do we do when it's over? And I find it very interesting to explore because I think a lot of people haven't been willing to grapple with that idea. But the fact that it's on such a broad level makes me wonder if maybe people have already just given up. Even if you think Fahrenheit 451. At the end of the book, the country gets blown up, essentially through a mix of apathy and popularity around censorship and anti-intellectual mindset. People ignore that there's a Cold War happening. And at the end of the book, the country is nuked and only the protagonist and a few people are left. So they have memorized a variety of books and they hope that in this new era where books are now allowed again, they can recover. Even though it's not like a hopeful ending in the sense that things get better, there is the potential. Even something as dark as Oryx and Crake by Margaret Atwood. At the end of the book, there is still the hope that a group of people will continue, even if it's not great. Planet of the Apes, there is a single human left. But yeah, recently I've seen this shift more towards what if it's just over? Now, I already struggle with depression, so on a personal level, I understand that it's something I need to manage. But recently I've been feeling very very hopeless about a lot of things. For example, I was in a car with some family members, and keep in mind, we're in a very conservative part of Alberta. Most people don't believe climate change is real, and I am in the minority in that sense. So we're sitting in the car, and they're talking about how it's going to be so great, and they were like, yeah, I don't really understand what the Paris climate agreements were about, but it's probably good for the US that they did that. And I don't know, I had like a weird out-of-body experience where I was just like, well, you don't really need to worry about it now. They were like, what? Why? And I was like, well, pretty much every expert that is even tangentially related to the environment is pretty much in agreement that we're reaching a tipping point, and once we hit that, there will be no going back. The whole point the climate agreement had that deadline of, I think it was 2030 something, is because we are in a bit of a time crunch here. The whole reason that the Liberal government implemented the strategies they did for the timelines that they did is because we are in a time crunch. So if the US is going to pull out, and they're a major contributor to those problems because they're the ones that are buying a lot of the resources, doing most of the trading, and directly a huge part of that supply chain, nothing we can do. Might as well just give up. Don't even bother recycling anymore. And I think this kind of put these people off, because generally I am very optimistic and hopeful, and I try to push for concrete solutions, because I believe just complaining about things isn't good enough. I think it just lets you vent, but it doesn't actually contribute anything. So I think this was kind of weird for people to hear from me. But yeah, for the last little bit, I've just kind of been like, I don't know, why bother? It's all just going to be garbage anyways. And that was on a personal level for me. I have experienced that multiple times where I've just given up on things because it's too hard and too overwhelming. But I never really considered that to be a problem that could affect an entire group of people in the same way. I assumed that was just like an individual mental health problem. But I had sort of like a weird epiphany. Okay, so for the last 8 years, while Justin Trudeau has been in office, he's not very popular in large parts of the country. His opponents, the Conservative Party, have been running on this platform of axe the tax. Every single topic, every single talking point, every single thing has to do with the carbon tax. You will be talking about something completely different, like the housing crisis, and they will somehow tie it all the way back to the carbon tax, and they will say, we need to axe the tax, this is hurting people, blah, 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 and that has been their entire platform. I tried to reach out to some people in the Conservative Party to see like if they are maybe behind the scenes considering other solutions for the different other things that affect Canadians, and every time it was always about the carbon tax. There was never any attempt to actually offer a solution. It was always, we're going to get rid of this, we're going to cut this, which I found very frustrating and not very forward thinking. So recently, now that we've had this whole thing where the US is saying, hey, we're going to tariff literally everything that Canadians import and export across the border, which is a significant portion of our economy, people have sort of been changing their sentiments, because before the Conservatives were very popular, and at least online now, people in Canada are shifting more towards being more mindful about buying local, buying Canadian, boycotting American products altogether. A lot of people are canceling even their digital services like Netflix, all in the pursuit of strengthening the economy. It was kind of a fringe opinion before that we should diversify the economy in any way because it's too expensive. And that was actually what I was talking to this person on Reddit about yesterday. Basically, someone said, oh, McCartney looks pretty good. They actually put up a lot of proposals that were helpful during our housing crash previously. I don't know how true that is. I'm actually not very familiar with McCartney, but they are sort of like the Liberal favorite to replace Justin Trudeau for the election because Justin Trudeau has stepped down. Because I've even seen a few Conservatives who are considering voting Liberal if this specific Liberal person is in charge because they have a pretty strong background in economic policy. So someone replied underneath that and they were like, well, we're still in the middle of a housing crisis, blah, 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 blah. Here's all these problems. I don't understand how putting money into these new initiatives could be strong and helpful, which I understood. We're in the middle of a lot of different things. We're in a period of high inflation. There's a lot of challenges that we're going through. So I responded, sort of what I was talking about is that previously, in times when we had a good economy, people had been trying to push for initiatives and green projects and all these other things for years because there were people that understood that relying entirely on oil and raw materials, which is our strongest area right now, isn't going to last forever. Things are being developed over to make room for new people. We're seeing a lot of catastrophic results with floods and fires, all kinds of big issues that make it hard to know what the future is going to be like for Canadians in those specific areas, because for right now, that's where all the good jobs are. But I don't know if that will be forever. And as I was talking to this person, they kept demanding solutions and they kept saying, well, what about this? Well, what about that? And I would say, well, we could do this. And then they would say, well, that wouldn't work because of XYZ obstacles. And it just kept going and going and going. And eventually I realized it wasn't probably very productive because I didn't think they actually wanted solutions. I think they just wanted to vent, and that's okay too. I think sometimes it's okay to vent about the problems you have. My whole point was that the excuse that something is too expensive to invest in is actually how we ended up here. We had all this time before to invest in new sectors and new strategies, and the time that someone tried to do it was during COVID because every time before it would get shut down. So now that we're actually in a real crisis on multiple fronts, it feels like too much. It's like it's too much to invest in, but what other options do you have? You know, a lot of people talk about very interesting concepts that might be helpful for Canadians. I don't know what those would be because I'm not a policymaker, but I can imagine some alternatives like agri-tech, or maybe putting more money into our media because digital products don't require raw resources and we have a lot of creatives, various different provinces. I don't know what those solutions would be. But the one thing I find very frustrating is when I interact with people and they don't want any solution. They are very happy to complain about the solutions you give them, to say that so-and-so is doing a bad job, but they never are willing to offer you alternatives. They're never willing to say, this is what I would want. And that makes it not very productive. I fell asleep and then I woke up and I had this idea for a blog post where I was going to talk about Depression era business strategies because I write blogs for small businesses and marketing and sometimes design. And as I was reading through some of the stuff on the 30s, I was struck by a lot of similarities. So, for example, one of the things that I came across while I was reading through it is that union power was heavily restricted. The government, at least in the US for sure, had been implementing anti-strike laws and trying to keep it so that there was regulation on those things specifically to help businesses succeed at the cost of the workers. So what was happening is that US workers weren't making enough money to feed themselves, let alone buy things in the economy. So nobody was buying products, so there was nothing to sell. And this caused a lot of stagnation, then there was inflation. People were paying for their housing and their healthcare and their education, and it was just too expensive because people weren't making any money. Then there was the fact that while this was all happening, businesses were price gouging things. They were basically profiting off of people who were already poor. At the same time, landlords and property owners were thriving because they could just keep asking for more and more, and there were no restrictions on what they could charge people for rent. So people just had to pay until they didn't have anywhere to live. Lots of businesses and landlords that were willing to do these kinds of practices thrived while their workers and the people that were supposed to be buying from them suffered, which I found very interesting to parallels we see today. Like Canadian housing market issues have to do with landlords being able to buy up all this property and then charge people exorbitant prices. We also had sort of a housing issue where essentially what's happening is the government would say these zones are for affordable housing or small housing that would be better for people that don't have enough money to buy a house. But the housing developers were buying up the land, paying the fine for not using the zoning properly, and then building houses because it was cheaper than actually building affordable housing for people that would be able to afford it. People are engaging in a lot of very risky, speculative debt stuff currently in the present day. In the 30s, it seemed like people would be buying on credit to invest in the stock market, which when that bubble burst was bad. We see people sort of experimenting with cryptocurrency now in a desperate attempt to sort of make a living for themselves. There's a lot of different parallels that I had never even thought about because in Canada, we were hit very hard in a very different way, but for similar reasons that we're experiencing now. The specific conversation I had with that person yesterday was that I was pointing out that our reliance on raw materials and oil specifically can only go so far, especially when we have trade interruptions like a bunch of tariffs being put on the goods that we import and export with our largest trade partner. And this person kept saying that this was just the way it always was. Canada will always be a raw material nation because that's just how the country is set up and there's nothing else we can do and everything else would be too expensive to put money into. Yeah, the interesting thing is the more I read into the Great Depression and the more I saw the similarities, including the fact that people began to not trust the banks and to not trust the government, the more I realized that the solutions people were pushing for in the 30s are the exact same things people are pushing for now. People are saying all the time, we need to support unions, we need to support striking, we need to support higher wages for people. And the thing is, the governments that were successful in turning the Great Depression around were doing things like investing in public infrastructure projects, in regulating the business industry better. And I find it interesting that we learned all these lessons in the 30s and we've completely thrown them away. Somehow the government has looked at these things and said, you know what I really like? Not doing any of those things. So I didn't even know this, but part of the thing that contributed to our experience in the 30s was that we had trade relationships break down because countries couldn't afford to import-export. Even though the US might not have been exactly the power that it was in that day, the fact that trade relations make you vulnerable vulnerable when these things happen is interesting, because what happened was that other countries started putting tariffs in to try to balance their economies that were suffering, and that actually made everybody poorer, which we're now probably going to see again in the US. So yeah, I don't know, I was looking at it and I was doing a lot of research on advertising and stuff, and I kept thinking to myself, well, people made it out of the 30s and they were in a much worse situation than we are now. Then I stumbled upon this really interesting article. It was somebody who was analyzing the way that the FDR New Deal was put together and the language that they used, which was very conservative. So I know I'm coming at you with a lot of different topics all at the same time, but I swear I'm going somewhere with this. They were essentially analyzing movies of the time, and they were talking about how a lot of movies during the Depression, especially coming out of the US, were focused on keeping people hopeful, because people didn't really want to grapple with very heavy topics or to worry about the way that the economy is right now. They didn't want to talk about it. They wanted to have a relative safety and something that felt familiar and happy. And initially I was like, I don't know what to do with this. But then they started getting into the way that things were communicated to people. So for example, when Teddy Roosevelt would address people, he would do what he called fireside chats, where it was really just like a casual conversation between him and the American people. And that seemed to resonate a lot better. And I think we see that a lot more now, where even stuff like ASMRs are more popular because people just want to experience something that feels very comforting and real and safe. One of the factors I remember behind why Donald Trump ended up being elected this time around is because one of the things he did that the Democrats didn't do was he went on podcasts that were popular with young men, and he just talked about stuff, which I think is probably more appealing to people that are looking for that kind of comfort in a very difficult time. This article talks about how some of the acts, like the Agricultural Adjustment Act or the National Industry Recovery Act, the way that they phrase these things are very conservative. It implies that like we're just strengthening stuff we already have, because in a time period where people are very poor and very scared, we tend to lean very conservative in the things that we're worried about. So even though some of the things that the New Deal was bringing into the equation were actually new and very innovative public works projects, it was phrased in a way that was comfortable to people. And this is something that occurred to me when I was talking to that person on Reddit the other night, is that they seemed very concerned with this black or white idea that either you could invest in new innovations and projects and cripple your economy, but you'd have to throw away all of the infrastructure we already had, or you keep going on the same path with raw materials and all these things. There are no middle ground. There's no alternatives. And every time I try to like point out like, hey, there is a middle ground, you know, you can do both. It requires strategy, but we have experts who would be able to figure that out. It was just like too much to handle. So this is where it's going to become very speculative very quickly. When I look at all these things, I look at the way media as a whole has gotten more pessimistic, and we're kind of reaching a point where we think there isn't really anything to do than just to accept that things are going to end soon. The way people in the 30s responded to the Depression and the way that they sort of gave up on doing innovative things on their own, they became very cautious and they just wanted things to remain mostly the same but get a little bit better. And we look at the way that people responded to different candidates during the presidential elections in the US. It's very clear that the world isn't ending, or at least not for a little bit yet. But I think people, almost as a group, have become very depressed. The fact that people are leaning more conservative isn't because they're bad people or that they're stupid or that they don't understand long-term effects. I think it's because we're all in a period of survival right now. So it's very hard to grasp the idea of doing something drastically different. Like when I was talking to that person, they kept arguing over and over again, and every time you'd give them a solution, they would shoot it down. It reminds me very much of when you interact with someone who's depressed, where you can say, hey, you could get a new job, and then if you find that new job, you'll make more money, and then your financial stress will be better. You could take your diploma and you could go here and here and you could try to network with these people, and they keep shooting you down. I know that that's not because those people don't want help. It's because the solutions you're offering feel too insurmountable in the moment. They need a simpler version. If you're someone who tends to think a lot about the future and to plan for the future in a very broad way, it's very easy to talk about something like the importance of diversification, or how you could take something like the tariff situation and you could actually bolster your own personal business by using that as a strength to appeal to people that are already mad about it and to give your business a stronger foundation. But when people as a whole group are very depressed and not open to new solutions, you have to start very small. With a depressed person, you don't say, hey, we're going to go for a walk. You say, hey, why don't you put on your socks first? And then after you put your socks on, you say, hey, why don't you get dressed? And then maybe we'll just sit on the couch. And then maybe while you're sitting on the couch, you say, hey, why don't we eat some food? Little by little, you get people to come back out of their shell again, but it takes time. Some things are too big. I don't really know what I'm offering in this video. I guess I'm just saying saying that if you are the kind of person who wants to see solutions and you have ideas, it's important to listen to the people around you and to tune into why they feel the way that they do. Because otherwise you can't help them. People are generally scared and fearful and in a survival mindset and very conservative in their values. And I'm not talking political parties. I'm talking about like fiscal values, because that's what you do when you're in a survival mode. That's what you think about. You don't have the energy to think about the future. Recently, I was going through the TruScum survey. I don't know if you've seen this. It's a bunch of trans people that sort of their response to the regular trans people has been, those people are crazy. We're the good trans people. And we believe that only transgender people who experience gender dysphoria are a real gender identity, and we don't need any of those other 72 genders. But I see it coming from a place of fear. I see that these people are scared because as a consequence of this huge response from people who are already very anti-LGBTQ and scared of all these new changes, they begin rolling back protections for trans adults, which I think isn't very fair if you're someone who thinks that you care about bodily autonomy. So I think it's very natural for people that are in an unsafe position. It's very natural to become very conservative and to sort of suppress yourself into a box so that you can be safe. And I don't think it's right to blame those people. It's better to help focus on the solutions that you can find together that are worth pursuing. And then if you're a person who is scared of the future and you don't really know what's going to happen, you don't want to see a lot of change because it doesn't feel like the right time, it might be worth considering that all of the things that worked when we were in our darkest places in human history all came around because of innovation, because of working together, because of supporting each other. When I was doing the readings and I came across this article on unions, one of the things they mentioned is that at the time, unions that had tradesmen and craftspeople generally did very well for themselves. They were able to simply say they weren't going to work because they weren't easy to replace, or miners in very rural areas could just say we're not going to do it, and then the bosses would have to listen because it was just too far away to get new workers in time to keep the supply chain going. But one of the things that unskilled unions had to do, like factories, was they started including people from all different genders and sexualities and races, and because they needed all the help they could get. And then what they would do is they started sit-down strikes, which were immediately outlawed, but it was very effective, where not only would they be harder to replace because they were physically at their workstations and you'd have to fight them to get them to move, it was a unified effort, so it worked a lot better. People that were innovative during the 30s, they did things like focusing on having good customer service, of having good public relations, of listening to what people cared about, and taking advantage of some of the sentiments people had. There is always opportunity if you know where to look, but it's hard. And I don't think everyone sees the world like that, but I think you definitely could. I've been thinking a lot about that, and I wonder if people across the board are actually genuinely depressed in some sense, and what kinds of solutions or moving forward could you do to make it feel less like an entire journey from getting out of bed to going on a walk to just putting your socks on and going to get some breakfast. Very little things, one step at a time. And I wish people knew how to communicate more like that, but it requires listening. So yeah, I don't know. I'm not really sure what this video is, but I hope you enjoyed it and at least learned some things. I know I covered a lot of very broad things, especially because there are specific socioeconomic factors that were different between Canada and the US, between what was happening. So I'll try to put some research links down in the description box just so you can see what I'm talking about. And yeah, I don't know. I hope this video was interesting, or at least thought-provoking in some way. I will talk to you later. Okay, bye.
I'm a talentless hack. I stole this line from Gord Downey starter cap. Got the right rhymes, but I can't keep time. And this metronome is my new deadline. I should be shilling my next CD, but the shiny